There was a time before plagues had names, before disease became divinity, before the first spore of hopelessness settled into the heart of a dying child and found there not resistance but recognition. I tell you this not as warning, but as record. Not as condemnation, but as the slow accounting of how terror becomes theology. The Plague Father did not arrive in our galaxy fully formed, crowned in antlers of bone and trailing flies like a procession of dark stars. He grew, he accumulated. He became inevitable, the way winter becomes inevitable, the way all gardens must eventually turn to mulch and memory. To understand Nurgle is to understand that decay was never the enemy of life, but its patient companion, walking just behind every breath, waiting with the kindness of certainty for the moment when all things surrender to their truest nature. This is his history. This is how the universe learned to love its own ending. In the beginning, there was no warp as we know it now. No churning sea of psychic energy divided into territories of rage and scheming and excess. There was only the Imperium, a mirror held up to real space, reflecting the thoughts and emotions of every living thing with cold fidelity. When the first microorganisms split and multiplied in the primordial seas of forgotten worlds, they knew nothing of philosophy or fear. They simply lived and died. But when the first sentient minds emerged, blinking into consciousness like newborns, stumbling from the dark, they brought with them something the universe had never known. They brought awareness of their own fragility. They looked at their flesh and saw that it could be torn. They felt hunger and understood that it could go unfed. They watched their elders wither and recognized the shape of their own futures. And in that moment of terrible clarity, the Imperium shuddered. Something stirred in its depths, formless and patient. A coalescence of dread shaped like inevitability. It had no name yet. It had no voice, but it was listening. The first plagues were natural things. Viruses adapting to new hosts. Bacteria overwhelming immune systems not yet evolved to resist them. But sentient beings did not experience them as natural. They experienced them as punishment, as randomness, as the universe showing its teeth. Entire civilizations rose on worlds whose names are now less than dust. Cultures that built pyramids to their gods and temples to their ancestors. And when the fevers came, they prayed, they begged, they sacrificed. And in the warp, that ocean of thought made manifest. Their terror pulled like rainwater in a depression, gathering depth and weight. The thing that would become Nurgle did not yet have eyes, but it felt their despair. It tasted the particular flavor of suffering that comes not from violence, but from betrayal by one's own body, from watching strength turn to weakness, from the humiliation of flesh rebelling against will. And it grew larger, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the patience of rot working through wood, it grew. Millions of years passed. Civilizations bloomed and fell. The old ones walked between stars and seeded worlds with purpose, crafting species like artisans, shaping clay. But even they could not craft immunity to entropy. Even their great works carried within them the seeds of decline. Ecosystems they designed eventually found equilibrium through predation and disease. The Eleldar rose in their first flowering, beautiful and vital, their emotions vivid enough to paint the warp in colors of passion and creativity. Yet even they knew sickness. Even they buried their dead and watched parents cradle dying children and felt the cold mathematics of population collapse. When plagues swept through their settlements, every funeral was a prayer. Every corpse was an offering. And in the depths of the Imperium, the gestating god of decay fed on their grief, growing more distinct with each century, accruing something like personality from the accumulated weight of 10,000 trillion identical moments of loss. The war in heaven changed everything. When the Necronir made their bargain with the Satan and became the Necrons, when the Old Ones responded by uplifting warrior races and weaponizing the warp itself, The galaxy became a furnace of suffering on a scale that had never before existed. Worlds burned. Populations were vaporized or enslaved. And in the wake of the great armies came something worse than weapons. Refugees carried diseases into new territories. Wounded soldiers festered in field hospitals that had no concept of sterilization. The dead were left to rot in trenches and craters, bloating under alien suns, leaking fluids into soil that would grow nothing for generations. The warp, already turbulent from the psychic screams of the dying, began to churn with new currents, and the thing that fed on despair and decay found itself glutted, swelling like a tumor fed by rich blood, taking on density and dimension. It began to dream, and its dreams were gardens. Imagine a place where nothing ever truly dies, where every corpse becomes compost for new growth, where fungi bloom in eye sockets and beetles make homes in hollowed ribcages, where the cycle of decay and renewal spins endlessly without the interruption of sanitization or fire. This was the first vision of the Garden of Nurgle. Not yet a true domain, but a psychic landscape taking shape in the deepest currents of the warp. It was not born from malice. That is the terrible truth. It was born from the acceptance that all things end, that all flesh is temporary, that the only constant in the universe is the breaking down of complexity into simplicity. And for those who suffered without hope of recovery, for those who watched their bodies fail and their strength fade, there was something almost comforting in that vision, a promise that their suffering had meaning, that their decay was part of a greater cycle, that they would be welcomed into the garden and allowed to rest, to become part of something larger than their individual pain. The first demons of Nurgle were not the plague-bearers we know now. They were simpler things, psychic constructs given form by the concentrated dread of entire populations facing extinction. They appeared as shadows in sick rooms, as figures glimpsed in fever dreams, as the feeling of presence that settles over a deathbed just before the final breath. They did not attack. They did not threaten. They simply waited. And their waiting had weight. It pressed down on the living like humidity before a storm, making every breath feel labored, every movement exhausting. Those who saw them reported a strange relief, a sense that resistance was futile. And therefore the burden of struggle could finally be set down. Entire hospital wards would fall silent as the protomans moved through them. And by morning, every patient would be dead, their faces slack with something that resembled peace. The survivors called it mercy. The warp called it sacrament. The prehistory of Nurgle is written in the extinction events of 1,000 forgotten species. Each mass death added to his substance. Each pandemic another layer of psychic sediment compressed into the foundation of his being. There were races whose names exist now only in the genetic memory of their successor species. Civilizations that rose to heights of cultural and technological achievement only to be felled by pathogens so virulent that their entire population collapsed within a single generation. The archaeological record of these dead worlds tells the same story again and again. Cities abandoned mid-construction. Tools left where they fell. Skeletal remains piled in makeshift mass graves that no one survived to properly consecrate. And in each case, the final phase of the civilization showed the same pattern. Religious fervor increasing. Temples being built or repurposed for new deities whose iconography centered on cycles and renewal and acceptance of death. Cults forming that preach surrender to the inevitable. The psychic imprint of these death cults fed directly into the growing consciousness that would become Nurgle, teaching it the languages of despair, the rituals of submission, the prayers that the hopeless whisper when all other gods have proven deaf. On a world whose coordinates have been expuned from all imperial records, there once existed a species of amphibious bipeds who achieved a form of civilization, remarkably advanced for their evolutionary stage. They built cities on the shores of warm seas, developed mathematics and astronomy, created art that expressed concepts of beauty and transcendence. But their biology made them vulnerable to fungal infections. And when a mutation arose in one of the native fungal species, turning it from benign symbiote to virulent parasite, their civilization collapsed in less than a standard year. The fungus spread through their population with terrifying efficiency, growing in their respiratory systems, sending fruiting bodies erupting through their skin, eventually consuming them from within while keeping them alive and ambulatory for weeks. The infected wandered in a daze, spreading spores with every breath. And the healthy fled into the deep ocean or high mountains, anywhere the fungus could not reach. But the fungus was patient. It evolved. It learned to survive in salt water, to tolerate cold, to lie dormant for years, waiting for a host. And one by one, the survivors were found and infected, until the last member of the species died choking on myellia in a cave high in the mountains, alone and afraid and wondering what they had done to deserve such a fate. Nothing. They had done nothing. That was the lesson the warp learned from their extinction. Suffering is not punishment. It is not earned. It simply is a fundamental property of existence, as inevitable as gravity. And from that realization, Nurgle drew his first true emotion. Not malice, not hatred, but pity. Deep, abiding paternal pity for all living things cursed with the awareness of their own mortality. He would have saved them if he could. But salvation is not in his nature. He can only offer comfort in the acceptance of what cannot be changed. And so the amphibians died, and their psychic death scream added to his growing essence. And he mourned them in the way a gardener mourns a failed crop with regret, but also with the understanding that failure is part of the process. And the soil enriched by their decay will nourish the next planting. Then came the fall. The Eldar Empire, in its decadent zenith, had grown so consumed by sensation and excess that their collective psychic emanations birthed Slaanesh, the youngest and most violent of the Chaos Gods. The psychic scream of she who thirsts tore through the warp like a blade through silk, and in the aftermath, the Imperium was forever changed. And so the amphibians died, and their psychic death scream added to his growing essence. And he mourned them in the way a gardener mourns a failed crop with regret, but also with the understanding that failure is part of the process. And the soil enriched by their decay will nourish the next planting. Then came the fall. The Eldar Empire in its decadent zenith had grown so consumed by sensation and excess that their collective psychic emanations birthed Slaanesh, the youngest and most violent of the Chaos Gods. The psychic scream of she who thirsts tore through the warp like a blade through silk. And in the aftermath, the Imperium was forever changed. The four great powers solidified into true divinity. K, who had just estated on aeons of warfare and murder, took his throne of skulls. Seen born from ambition and scheming, claimed his crystal labyrinth. Slaanesh, newborn but voracious, carved out domains of impossible pleasure and exquisite pain. And Nurgle, eldest of the four in the slow accumulation of his essence, finally opened his eyes in his garden and laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the chuckle of a grandfather watching children play, warm and indulgent and utterly devoid of malice. He had been waiting so long. And now, at last, the universe was ready to understand what he offered. His garden expanded in that moment of cosmic restructuring. Where before it had been a vague psychic landscape, it now became a true realm within the warp. Vast beyond measurement and teeming with a grotesque vitality that mocked every natural law. Trees grew there with bark-like diseased flesh, their branches heavy with fruits that wept pus and honey in equal measure. Rivers flowed thick with bile and swarmed with microscopic life forms that had never existed in real space. Each one a unique expression of decay's creative potential. The sky, if it could be called a sky, hung low and green with perpetual fog. And through that fog drifted spores the size of houses, drifting on currents of flatulent wind that carried the smell of compost and gangrene and strangely fresh earth after rain. Nurglings tumbled through the undergrowth, giggling as they gnawed on rotting logs and each other, their tiny bodies regenerating as quickly as they were damaged. And at the center of it all, in a man's built from calcified bone and living wood, Nurgle himself took his true form for the first time. Massive, bloated, fatherly, his skin was the color of old bruises. His belly distended with the accumulated diseases of a million worlds. Antlers sprouted from his skull, wreathed in flies that sang his praises in the key of decay. And he smiled because he loved every one of his children. Every virus and bacterium and parasitic worm with the unconditional devotion of a creator who sees no flaw in his creations. The architecture of the garden defies conventional description because it exists, partially outside the normal dimensions of space. Paths wind through fungal forests that grow denser the deeper you travel. Yet somehow you can walk for subjective hours and still see the same trees, the same clearings, as if the garden loops back on itself in ways that Euclidean geometry cannot accommodate. Structures rise from the mulch, buildings that appear to be grown rather than built, their walls pulsing with sluggish circulation, their windows weeping condensation that smells of sickness and soil. These are the manes of the great unclean ones, each daemon lord, maintaining its own subdomain within the larger garden, cultivating specialized ecosystems that reflect their particular interests. One might focus on waterborne diseases, filling its territory with stagnant pools and swamps that breed parasites of exquisite virulence. Another might prefer airborne contagions, creating forests of trees that shed pollen heavy with spores that drift on the wind like snow. And at the heart of each subdomain sits the demon itself, enormous and jovial, tending to its gardens with the care of a master, craftsman perfecting his art. The rivers of the garden deserve special mention. They flow uphill as often as down, defying gravity through mechanisms that are more psychic than physical, carrying slurries of organic matter in various states of decomposition. Some rivers run with blood so thick it barely qualifies as liquid, clotting in eddies and pools where it attracts clouds of insects. Others flow with bile or pus or stranger fluids that have no equivalent in real space. Secretions from creatures that exist only in Nurgle's imagination given physical form through the power of his will. And in these rivers swim things that were never born and can never truly die. Fish with scales of scabrous skin. Eels that are more parasite than predator. Crustaceans that walk on too many legs and filter the foul water through gills that resemble tumorous growths. To drink from these rivers is to invite transformation. The water carries the essence of Nurgle's domain, and mortal flesh exposed to it begins to change. Cells mutating according to patterns that serve the Plague Father's design rather than the drinker's survival. The flora of the garden represents perhaps Nurgle's greatest creative achievement. Every plant that grows there serves a purpose within the ecosystem of decay. There are trees whose fruits contain concentrated diseases, each one a carefully cultivated strain intended for specific application in real space. Bushes that grow needles filled with toxins, vines that strangle and digest anything they touch, secret trading enzymes that break down organic matter into components that the garden can absorb and repurpose. Flowers that release spores with every breeze. Pollen that carries genetic payloads designed to infiltrate and subvert healthy ecosystems. And fungi everywhere, growing on every surface, in every shadow. Massive shelf fungi the size of landing pads extending from the sides of rotting logs. Puffballs that release clouds of spores when disturbed. Networks of mycelium connecting everything to everything else in a vast underground web of communication and nutrient exchange. The garden is not merely alive. It is hyper-alive, teeming with so much biological activity that the very air shimmers with it, thick and humid, and alive with the buzz of insects and the whisper of growing things. The fauna are equally diverse and equally horrific. Beyond the demons themselves, the garden hosts creatures that defy categorization. Beasts that might have once been natural animals, but have been so transformed by exposure to warp energy that their origins are unrecognizable. Things that slither and crawl and fly on wings of membrane, stretched between bones that protrude at anatomically impossible angles. Predators that hunt not for food, but for the joy of spreading infection, biting their prey and then following it for days as the diseases take hold. Watching with what might be fascination as the victim's flesh rots and slows away. And prey species that have evolved defenses based not on avoiding death, but on making their own decay as productive as possible. Bodies designed to burst when killed and spread spores or parasites or virulent bacteria across a wide area, ensuring that even in death they serve the garden's purpose. The sounds of the garden form a constant symphony of rot. The wet squelch of Nurglings burrowing through decomposing matter. The drone of flies, billions of them, creating a baseline hum that underlies every other noise. The bubbling of the rivers, the hiss of spores being released, the crack of branches breaking under their own diseased weight. The laughter of great unclean ones echoing from distant mains. The monotone chanting of plague-bearers reciting their endless tallies. The screams, always the screams of mortal souls who found their way into the garden and discovered that it was not the peaceful refuge they had been promised, but a place of eternal transformation, where their bodies would be taken apart and reassembled according to logics they could not comprehend, where suffering persisted but lost its sharp edges, becoming a dull, constant ache that eventually felt like normally. Nurgle tends to his garden personally, walking its paths with the gait of a being whose vast bulk should render movement impossible, but who moves nonetheless with surprising grace. He stops to examine individual plants, pruning here, fertilizing there, speaking to his creations in a voice like distant thunder, filtered through mucus. The demons defer to him with genuine affection, not the cringing fear that Khorne's servants show or the scheming calculation of Tion's minions. They love him, and he loves them back, each according to its nature. He knows every Nurgling by name, all trillion of them, and greets each with warmth when their paths cross. He consults with his great unclean ones as colleagues, soliciting their opinions on matters of plague cultivation and strategic deployment. He even shows kindness to the plague-bearers, those melancholy demons who derive no joy from their existence, offering them words of encouragement and the assurance that their work is valued and necessary. The Great Crusade brought humanity into prominence, and with it came new opportunities for the Plague Father's gifts. The Emperor of Mankind, in his arrogance, believed he could unite the galaxy under reason and imperial truth, scrubbing away superstition and religion and leaving only the cold light of science. But human nature resists such erasure. The soldiers of the Crusade, for all their genetic enhancement and technological superiority, still felt fear. They still watched their brothers die in the trenches of alien worlds. They still contracted diseases on planets where the local microbiology had evolved in isolation for millions of years, and no amount of apothecary intervention could save them when something truly virulent took hold. And in their moments of weakness, in field hospitals where the smell of gangrene overpowered even the recycled air, some of them prayed, not to the Emperor, who they had been told was not a god, but to the sensation of release they felt when the pain became too great to bear, to the idea that suffering might end not in death, but in transformation. And Nurgle heard those prayers. He reached across the warp with tendrils of influence so subtle they seemed like coincidence, like bad luck, like the natural progression of infection. But they were anything but natural. The first recorded instance of Nurgle's direct interference in the Great Crusade came during the compliance action on Goss II, a world whose inhabitants had regressed to a feudal state, but retained genetic markers suggesting descent from a much higher technological civilization. The Imperial forces encountered unexpected resistance from the locals, who fought with a fervor that seemed religious. Despite the planet's apparent lack of organized faith, the campaign bogged down into trench warfare, and in the third month of the siege of the planetary capital, an outbreak occurred among the Imperial forces. At first, it seemed like a natural disease, perhaps picked up from contact with local fauna or contaminated water supplies. The symptoms were consistent with known bacterial infections: fever, nausea, weakness. The apothecaries treated it as routine, administering broad-spectrum antibiotics and isolating the infected. But the disease did not respond to treatment. It spread despite quarantine measures, and its symptoms evolved, becoming stranger and more severe with each passing day. Soldiers reported sensations of insects crawling beneath their skin. Their wounds refused to heal, instead developing thick crusts that cracked and wept when they moved. And some of them began to hear voices, whispers in a language they did not know, but somehow understood, promising relief from suffering if they would only stop resisting and accept what was happening to them. The outbreak claimed 3,000 soldiers before it burned itself out. Most died. Some survived, but were so transformed by the experience that they could no longer serve and were shipped back to Terra for study and eventual disposal. And a handful disappeared entirely, deserting their posts and fleeing into the wilderness of Goss too, never to be seen again. The official report attributed the incident to an unknown local pathogen and recommended enhanced biosecurity protocols for future compliance actions on primitive worlds. But the remembrances attached to the expedition, those civilian observers tasked with documenting the Great Crusade for posterity, recorded stories that never made it into the official histories. Stories of soldiers who claimed to have seen a garden in their fever dreams, a place of terrible beauty where their pain transformed into purpose. Stories of whispered prayers to a grandfather figure who promised to make everything better. Stories that were suppressed and expugned and forgotten, but which left traces in the warp. Psychic echoes that Nurgle collected and savored like a connoisseur sampling fine wines. As the Great Crusade expanded and the number of active war zones multiplied, the opportunities for such outbreaks increased exponentially. The Imperium was conquering worlds at a pace that strained its logistical capabilities. Medical supplies ran short. Quarantine protocols were abbreviated in the interest of maintaining campaign momentum. Soldiers fought on dozens of different worlds with dozens of different biospheres, exposing themselves to pathogens their bodies had never encountered. And the stress of constant warfare weakened immune systems, making even minor infections potentially fatal. It was a perfect environment for plague, and Nurgle exploited it with characteristic patience. He did not attempt grand gestures or massive outbreaks that would draw attention. Instead, he worked through small interventions, nudging mutation rates slightly higher here, weakening a quarantine barrier there, ensuring that diseases spread just a little faster than they would have naturally. The cumulative effect was a baseline of sickness that permeated the Crusade fleets, a constant drain on manpower and morale that the Imperium accepted as the cost of war. And every soldier who died from preventable disease, every world where the conquerors brought plague along with enlightenment, was a small victory for the Plague Father. But Nurgle's patience was not infinite. As the Great Crusade drew toward its conclusion, and the Emperor turned his attention to the great works that would occupy him during the coming era of peace, the Primarchs began to feel the first stirrings of dissent. Some, like Horus, were motivated by ambition and resentment. Others, like Logar, by religious conviction. And a few, like Mortarion, by a bitter philosophy born from lifetimes of suffering and the recognition that the Emperor's vision of a secular Imperium was built on hypocrisy and lies. Mortarion was the perfect target for Nurgle's attention. A Primarch who understood suffering on an intimate level. who had spent his formative years in environments that would kill unaugmented humans in minutes, who had built his legion around the principle of endurance, of outlasting the enemy through sheer, stubborn refusal to die, and who harbored a deep-seated fear of helplessness that he had never acknowledged even to himself. Mortarion Primarch of the Death Guard was the most tragic of all Nurgle's acquisitions. Born on the pagan world of Barbaros, he had spent his youth learning to endure where others would break, climbing through toxic clouds that killed unaugmented humans in minutes, hunting the necromantic overlords who ruled from mountain peaks shrouded in poison. He was a survivor, a stubborn, defiant survivor who believed that strength came from endurance, that suffering was a test to be passed through force of will. When the Emperor found him and took him to the stars, Mortarion brought with him a philosophy of grim determination, teaching his legion to fight through any hardship, to never yield, to embrace the Reaper Sith as a symbol of inevitable victory. But he also brought with him a hatred of tyrants and a deep, unspoken fear of helplessness, and that fear would be his undoing. During the Horus Heresy, when half the Imperium turned against the Emperor and fought brother in a war that would scar the galaxy for millennia, Mortarion sided with Horus. His reasons were complex, born from resentment and philosophical disagreement and the quiet rage of a son who felt his father had robbed him of his final triumph on Barbaros. The Emperor had descended from orbit and killed the last necromancer overlord before Mortarion could reach him, claiming the victory that should have been Mortarion's alone. It was a small thing, perhaps in the grand scheme of galactic conquest, but small wounds fester when left untreated, and Mortarion had been left to fester for 2 centuries, his resentment growing with each passing year, each new world conquered in the Emperor's name. Each time he was reminded that for all his strength and all his achievements, he was still subordinate to a being who had never asked if he wanted to be saved. In aligning with Horus, he thought he was choosing freedom. Instead, he was choosing a different form of bondage, one that would prove far more complete than anything the Emperor had imposed. At first, Mortarion resisted the influence of chaos. He saw what it had done to some of his brothers, how Fulgrim had become a serpentine monster of excess, how Angron had been elevated to demihood and lost what little humanity remained. Mortarion wanted victory, not transformation. He believed that the traitor forces could win through conventional means, through superior strategy and the righteous fury of sons betrayed by their father. He rejected the overtures of the dark gods, refused to participate in rituals, maintained strict discipline within his legion, even as other traitor forces descended into barbarism and excess. For a time, this strategy seemed to work. The Death Guard fought with brutal efficiency in the early stages of the heresy, securing victory after victory through their characteristic combination of overwhelming firepower and refusal to break under pressure. But Horus had made promises to the dark gods in exchange for their support, and those promises included the souls of certain Primarchs. Mortarion was one of them, and the gods are patient collectors of debts. The Death Guard fleet became trapped in the warp during their journey to terror. Time lost meaning in that place where reality bends to emotion and thought. What seemed like days to the mortal crew was perhaps weeks, perhaps months, perhaps years. The ships drifted through psychic currents that defied navigation, their navigators going mad from visions of impossible geometries, their Geller fields flickering and failing at random intervals. And during that endless voyage, locked in the space between spaces with no hope of escape, the destroyer hive was released. Whether by sabotage or accident or the cruel design of Nurgle himself, the records do not agree. The most commonly accepted version holds that a lone cultist, a menial who had been secretly worshipping Nurgle for years, broke the seals on a containment chamber deep in the bowels of the flagship and unleashed something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. But other accounts suggest that the plague arose spontaneously, generated by the warp itself in response to Nurgle's will, manifesting in the ships without any need for physical vector. The truth is likely irrelevant. The result was undeniable. A plague unlike anything the Death Guard had encountered swept through the fleet with the speed of wildfire and the tenacity of deep rot. Legionaries who had survived the worst bow-upons the galaxy could throw at them fell ill within hours. Their armor fused to their flesh through the Primarch's modifications, became prisons of agony as infections bloomed in the spaces between ceramite and skin. Pus leaked from the seals of their helms. Their respirators clogged with bloody phlegm, and no apothecary could stop it. No quarantine could contain it. The disease spread through ventilation systems, through shared corridors, through the very air they breathed. It evolved faster than it could be studied, developing resistance to every treatment almost before the treatment could be administered. And its symptoms were designed with cruel precision to maximize suffering. Boils erupted across every centimeter of skin, filling with pus and then bursting to spread infection to new areas. Internal organs began to fail in sequence. Liver, then kidneys, then lungs. Each shutdown preceded by days of escalating pain. Motor control deteriorated, leaving once mighty warriors trembling and weak, unable to hold weapons or even stand without support. And through it all, they remained conscious. The disease did not grant the mercy of delirium or coma. It kept its victims aware and lucid so they could fully appreciate what was happening to them. The fleet became a flying mausoleum, its corridors echoing with the wet coughs of dying warriors and the prayers of those who begged for any god, any power to make the suffering stop. Mortarion watched his legion die. He moved through the ships trying to maintain order, trying to enforce quarantine protocols, trying to find a solution through sheer intellectual force. He locked himself in his chambers with every medical text in the fleet archives, studying the disease with the focus of a man who understands that failure means annihilation. He worked without sleep, without rest, pushing his Primarch physiology to its limits, searching for a weakness in the plague structure, a vulnerability he could exploit. But there was no weakness. The disease was perfect. It was not a natural evolution, but a crafted thing designed by an intelligence that understood biology on levels that made human science look like cave paintings. And as the days bled into each other and the death toll climbed into the thousands, Mortarion felt something he had not felt since childhood: helplessness. The slow realization that his strength, his endurance, his stubborn refusal to yield meant nothing in the face of an enemy that could not be fought with bolter or blade. He tried everything. He ordered the infected into airlocks and vented them into space, hoping to stop the spread through brutal triage. But the disease was already everywhere, and all he accomplished was the murder of warriors who might have recovered. He attempted chemical sterilization of entire decks, flooding them with compounds so toxic they melted bulkheads. But the plague survived and adapted, its next generation immune to the very chemicals meant to destroy it. He even considered scuttling the entire fleet, ordering the ships to translate back into real space and self-destructing in the hope that at least the death would be quick. But the navigators were too far gone, their minds shattered by warp exposure. And without them, the fleet was trapped in the Imperium with no way out. Mortarion was a prisoner in his own flagship, watching helplessly as everything he had built over 2 centuries crumbled into rot and ruin. And in that moment of absolute despair, Nurgle spoke to him, not with words, but with a feeling, a gentle psychic pressure. Like a hand on the shoulder of a grieving man, an offer of release. A promise that if Mortarion swore himself to the Plague Father, the suffering would end, his legion would be saved. They would be transformed into something greater than mere Astartes, something eternal and beyond the reach of death. All he had to do was kneel. He refused at first. Mortarion was too proud, too bitter about having his autonomy stripped by the Emperor to willingly submit to another master. He screamed defiance into the empty air of his chambers, hurled furniture, and smashed instruments. Raged against the injustice of being backed into a corner where surrender was the only option. But Nurgle did not withdraw. The offer remained, hanging in the air like the smell of rot, impossible to ignore. And as more of his sons died, as their gin-enhanced bodies failed and their screams echoed through the Vox channels, Mortarion felt his resolve crumble. He had built his entire identity on endurance, on the ability to withstand what others could not. But there is a point where endurance becomes torture, where survival without hope of recovery is worse than death. And he reached that point not when his own suffering became unbearable, but when he realized that his pride was killing his sons, that his refusal to surrender was not strength but selfishness, that a true leader would accept any cost, bear any shame, if it meant saving those under his command. He knelt, alone in his chambers, surrounded by the medical texts that had proven useless and the instruments that had failed to find a cure. Mortarion fell to his knees and spoke the words that bound him to Nurgle's service. The oath was simple. He swore to serve the Plague Father in all things, to spread his gifts across the galaxy, to embrace decay as sacred and endurance as holy. And in exchange, the Destroyer Hive stopped its work. The dying stopped dying. The pain that had consumed the fleet for weeks ebbed away like a tide retreating from a shore. But they did not return to health. Instead, they were remade. The infections that had ravaged them became permanent, integrated into their biology as gifts rather than afflictions. Their armor fused completely with their flesh, becoming a second skin of rotting ceramite and corrupted metal. Their breath turned to toxic fog. Their blood thickened to sludge. Horns erupted from helms, tentacles sprouted from armor joints, and they rose as plague marines. The Death Guard reborn as the mortal champions of the Plague Father, forever trapped in a state between life and death, suffering eternally, but no longer capable of truly dying. Mortarion himself was transformed into something far worse. Nurgle granted him demonhood, elevating him to the rank of Demon Primarch and binding him eternally to the Garden. The transformation was agonizing and ecstatic in equal measure. His genetic structure unraveling and reassembling according to patterns dictated by warp energy and divine will. His wings, once symbols of his ability to rise above the poison clouds of Barbarous, became tattered and leathery, dripping ichor with every beat. His scythe silence grew bloated with demonic power, able to kill with a touch and spread plagues that could devastate entire star systems. And his face, once grim but human, became a mask of decayed nobility, his eyes glowing with the terrible knowledge of what he had become. He served Nurgle not out of love but out of resignation, leading the Death Guard in their campaigns across the galaxy, with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has accepted that all resistance is futile. And Nurgle cherished him, not as a slave, but as a favored son, granting him independence and resources and affection in that smothering paternal way that makes rebellions seem ungrateful. The plague wars that followed were some of the most horrific conflicts in Imperial history. The Death Guard descended on worlds with methodical cruelty, not seeking to conquer, but to infect. They would land in force and establish beachheads, then release plagues into the water supplies, the ventilation systems, the very soil. The diseases they deployed were not random. Each was specifically designed for the target world, tailored to exploit the local population's biology, their environmental conditions, their infrastructure weaknesses. On agri-worlds, the plagues attacked the crops, causing them to rot in the fields or mutate into poisonous variants that looked and smelled normal but killed anyone who consumed them. On hive worlds, airborne contagions spread through ventilation systems, reaching every level from the underhive to the spires in a matter of days. On forge worlds, technoganic viruses infected machine spirits, causing factories to produce tainted components that failed catastrophically when put under stress. The Death Guard did not fight pitched battles unless forced to. They simply landed, deployed their plagues, and waited for the world to collapse under the weight of its own suffering. Populations would sicken within days, their immune systems overwhelmed by diseases that had been cultivated in the Garden of Nurgle and refined over millennia. Hospitals overflowed, medical supplies ran out. Quarantine measures failed as the sheer number of infected made containment impossible. And as they died, their despair fed the Plague Father, strengthening his hold on real space and allowing more of his demons to cross the veil. Entire sectors fell to rot. Agri-worlds became wastelands where crops grew twisted and poisonous. Hive cities descended into anarchy as plagues spread faster than medical services could respond, turning streets into open graves and hab blocks into tombs. And the worst part was the acceptance. Many who suffered under Nurgle's plagues reported a strange comfort in their final days, a sense that their pain had meaning, that they were part of something larger. They stopped resisting. They welcomed the Nurglings that crawled from the shadows to nestle against their dying flesh. They smiled as the rot took them, grateful for the promise of rest. The psychological impact of the Plague Wars was arguably more devastating than the physical casualties. The Death Guard did not simply kill populations, they broke them. Survivors of Nurgle's campaigns often exhibited symptoms of profound spiritual trauma, a fatalistic acceptance of suffering that made them vulnerable to future corruption. They had seen the face of entropy and recognized it as inevitable. They had watched friends and family succumb to diseases that medicine could not cure, that prayers could not prevent, that strength and courage could not overcome. And they had learned the lesson that Nurgle wanted them to learn. That suffering is universal, that resistance is futile. That peace can only be found in surrender. These psychological scars spread through the Imperium like a slow-acting virus, eroding faith in the Emperor and the Imperial Creed, creating pockets of nihilism and despair that cultists could exploit. A world might be cleansed of physical taint, its infected populations purged, and its infrastructure rebuilt. But the memory of what Nurgle had done lingered in the collective consciousness, a wound that never fully healed. But Nurgle's influence extended far beyond the Death Guard. He was the god of entropy, and entropy touches all things. In the underhives of terror, in the depths of forge worlds where machinery ran unchecked for 10,000 years, in the forgotten corners of the Imperium where hope had long since died. His worship spread like mold on damp walls. Cults formed around the idea that suffering was inevitable, and therefore resistance was foolish. They called themselves the infected, the blighted, the children of the garden, and they conducted rituals that horrified even the Inquisition. Human sacrifices left to rot in sealed chambers until their decay reached a state of perfect ripeness, the bodies bloating and bursting and releasing spores that the cultists would inhale as a sacrament. SELF, flagellation with rusted blades to invite infection. The wounds deliberately left untreated so they would fester and spread. Communion services where the faithful drank from cups of stagnant water and ate bread molded with spores of alien fungi. Each bite a gamble with death that the truly devoted welcomed. And these cults thrived because they offered something the Imperium could not. They offered relief. In a galaxy where life was brutal and short, where the average citizen could expect nothing but labor and death in service to an uncaring bureaucracy, the promise of release, of being welcomed into a garden where suffering transformed into belonging was intoxicating. The rituals varied from cult to cult, but certain elements appeared with remarkable consistency across different worlds and populations. The veneration of decay as a sacred process, the cultivation of diseases as precious gifts, the belief that the body's betrayal through sickness was not a curse but a blessing. the Plague Father reaching out to claim his children. Cultists would gather in secret, often in the most squalid areas of a settlement. Places where imperial authority had minimal presence and sanitation was non-existent. Abandoned water treatment facilities. Condemned blocks scheduled for demolition. The deepest levels of underhives where the air was so toxic that normal humans could only survive with rebreathers. And in these spaces, they would create shrines. Makeshift altars constructed from rotting organic matter. Corpses arranged in patterns that held psychic significance. Offerings of diseased flesh and spoiled food left to attract flies. The flies were particularly important to Nurgle's cultists. They saw in them the sacred messengers of the Plague Father, carriers of his gifts. Symbols of the transformation from death to new life through the medium of decay. Inquisitors who investigated these cults reported phenomena that defied rational explanation. Rooms that were larger on the inside than the outside, spaces that seemed to connect to somewhere else. Somewhere warm and humid and filled with the sound of buzzing insects. Cultists who showed no fear of death even under the most extreme interrogation. Who smiled as they were tortured and whispered prayers of gratitude as they expired. Plague victims who should have been dead days ago continuing to move and speak. Their bodies animated by forces that had nothing to do with conventional biology. And on occasion manifestations, demons crossing the veil in response to the cultists' worship. Nurglings tumbling into real space to frolic among their worshippers. Plague bearers emerging to spread contagion with methodical precision, and very rarely a great, unclean one. A towering presence of rot and fatherly affection that would bless the faithful and condemn the unbelievers to fates worse than death. The Great Rift changed the strategic landscape of the galaxy. When Abdon, the Despoiler, finally succeeded in his 13th black crusade and the galaxy was torn in half by a psychic wound that spilled the warp into real space, Nurgle saw opportunity. The Imperium Nihilus, the dark half of the galaxy cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, became a playground for chaos. The warp storms that raged across the rift made travel nearly impossible, severing supply lines and communication networks, leaving entire sectors isolated and vulnerable. And Nurgle moved with characteristic patience, seeding plagues into worlds that were already struggling, tipping civilizations that were barely holding on into full collapse. Supply chains broke down. Starvation followed. And in the wake of starvation came disease. Always disease. Because hungry people drink from contaminated sources and eat spoiled food and crowd together in unsanitary conditions that turn minor infections into epidemics. The Plague Father did not need to conquer these worlds. He simply waited for them to fall into his lap like overripe fruit dropping from a tree. The demon worlds that emerged in the wake of the Great Rift were unlike anything the Imperium had encountered before. Entire planets transformed into extensions of the garden. Their biospheres rewritten according to Nurgle's design. Their populations converted or consumed. These worlds became staging grounds for further invasions. Reservoirs of plague and corruption that could spawn armies of demons without limit. The most infamous was Gothos II, the same world where Nurgle had first interfered during the Great Crusade. In the millennia since that initial outbreak, the planet had been conquered and reconquered, purged and resettled, bombed and rebuilt dozens of times. But the taint had never fully left. And when the Great Rift opened and the barriers between warp and real space thinned, Garthos II underwent a catastrophic transformation. The ground split open, releasing geysers of toxic sludge from reservoirs that had been building beneath the crust for 10,000 years. The oceans boiled and turned to festering swamps. The atmosphere thickened with spores until breathing became an act of infection. And from the warp came dams in numbers beyond counting, pouring through the weakened barriers to claim the world for Nurgle, in a ceremony of corruption that lasted 7 days and 7 nights and left nothing alive that had not been transformed into something utterly alien to its original form. The Plague Wars on Ultramar were Nurgle's greatest triumph in this new age. Mortarion returned to real space, leading a colossal invasion force, targeting the realm of his brother rowboat Guilliman with the specific intent of corrupting it beyond recovery. Ultramar had always been a symbol of the Imperium at its best, a sector where governance actually functioned, where citizens lived relatively decent lives, where hope was not entirely crushed under the weight of authoritarianism and war. It was a model of what the Emperor had intended the Imperium to become, proof that humanity could thrive if given proper leadership and resources. Nurgle hated it for that reason, not with the hot anger of corn, but with the quiet malice of mold creeping up a wall. He wanted to prove that even the best the Imperium could offer would eventually rot. That order was temporary and decay was eternal. That Guilliman's dream of a functional civilization was nothing more than a delay of the inevitable. And Mortarion, dutiful in his bitterness, delivered. The Death Guard landed on dozens of worlds simultaneously. Their bloated ships vomiting plague zombies and Nurglings, and worse things, onto populations that had known relative peace for centuries. The invasion was not a blitzkrieg, but a methodical strangling. Each world subjected to calculated campaigns designed to maximize suffering and corruption. Unspanned, the Death Guard deployed airborne plagues that targeted specific genetic markers common in the Ultramaran population, ensuring maximum infection rates with minimal warning. On Palmano, they contaminated the oceans with technorganic viruses that transformed marine ecosystems into breeding grounds for demonic parasites. On Talisar, they simply laid siege to the major cities and waited, allowing starvation and desperation to do most of the work, while they deployed plagues at intervals to prevent any relief efforts from succeeding. Cities burned with warp fire that did not consume but transformed, turning stone to diseased flesh and metal to calcified bone. The defenders fought with desperate courage. Ultramarines chapters and PDF forces holding the line against impossible odds. But courage means nothing against an enemy that cannot die, that resurrects from every wound, that infects through proximity and breath and the simple act of being observed. Guilliman returned to save his realm, elevated by the Emperor's power and wielding the sword of the Emperor, a blade that could permanently kill demons and burn through corruption with the light of anthemic fire. He had been resurrected from stasis by the machinations of the Inari and the intervention of the Emperor himself, restored to life to serve as Lord Commander of the Imperium in its darkest hour. His return had sparked hope across the galaxy, proof that the Emperor still watched and still cared enough to intervene when all seemed lost. But now that hope was being tested. Guilliman fought with the cold precision of a master tactician and the righteous fury of a son defending his father's dream, leading the defense of Ultramar with a brilliance that reminded the galaxy why he had been one of the Emperor's most trusted generals. But Mortarion was his equal in strategic thinking and his superior in sheer persistence. And the Death Guard had advantages that conventional forces could not match. They did not tire. They did not break. And every world they touched remained corrupted even after they withdrew, requiring decades of cleansing and quarantine to return to something approaching normally. The battles between the two Primarchs were apocalyptic. Mortarion wielded all the gifts Nurgle had given him, summoning clouds of flies the size of gunships, spreading plagues that killed in seconds, reshaping reality through the power of his patron. His mere presence on a battlefield was enough to sicken and demoralize enemy forces. The aura of decay that surrounded him, sapping strength and corrupting war gear. He fought with silence, his demonic scythe, cutting through armor and flesh with equal ease, leaving wounds that festered and spread infection with supernatural speed. And he commanded the Death Guard with the expertise of someone who had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of warfare through attrition. deploying his forces with patience and precision, grinding down the defenders through sheer, relentless pressure. Guilliman countered with the Sword of the Emperor, a weapon so anthemic to chaos that its mere touch could unravel demonic essence and purge corruption from infected flesh. He led from the front, inspiring his forces through personal example, holding the line when all seemed lost and launching counterattacks with surgical precision. And he had one advantage that Mortarion lacked. He still believed victory was possible. He still held hope that the Imperium could be saved. And that hope, that refusal to accept defeat, gave him strength that Mortarion could no longer access. Their final confrontation on the world of Ajax ended with Mortarion's banishment, his demonic form torn apart by the Emperor's sword and cast screaming back into the warp. Guilliman stood over the spot where his brother had fallen, the sword still burning with holy fire. And for a moment he allowed himself to believe that he had won, that Ultramar was saved, that the nightmare was over. But it was not a true victory. Ajax was left devastated, its population reduced to a fraction of its former number. Entire continents rendered uninhabitable by lingering plagues that would take centuries to cleanse. The garden moon that had once orbited Ajax, a paradise world of carefully cultivated ecosystems and artistic beauty, had been transformed into a demon world, its surface covered in the same fungal forests and toxic swamps that characterized the Garden of Nurgle. And across Ultramar, on every world the Death Guard had touched, the scars remained. Populations traumatized, infrastructure destroyed, faith shaken. Nurgle had lost the war, but won something more valuable. He had proven that even Ultramar could be hurt. Even the best humanity could offer was vulnerable, and that knowledge spread through the Imperium like a whisper in a sick room, eroding morale and faith in ways no military defeat could match. In the garden, Nurgle celebrated. His man's, the Plague Lord's domain, rang with the sound of laughter and the wet squelch of diseased flesh in motion. Demons of every variety cavorted through the fungal forests, plague-bearers tallying new infections with bureaucratic devotion. Beasts of Nurgle bounding after fleeing souls with the enthusiastic stupidity of puppies. Great unclean ones presiding over bubbling cauldrons where new plagues were brewed from the rendered essence of suffering. And at the center of it all, Nurgle sat on his throne of fused skeletons, cradling a vial of Nurgle's rot, his favorite disease, the contagion that transformed mortal victims into plague-bearers through a process of agonizing metamorphosis. He whispered to it like a father whispering to a beloved child, praising its virulence, encouraging it to spread and grow and claim more souls for the garden. He was content, not triumphant, because triumph implies struggle, and Nurgle had never struggled. He had simply waited. He had allowed the universe to come to him as it always would, because decay is patient and entropy always wins in the end. But there were depths to Nurgle's nature that even his most devoted followers did not fully understand. He was not merely the god of disease. He was the god of despair, transformed into acceptance. Every daemon in his service had once been a mortal who suffered so completely that they stopped fighting and welcomed the end. The plague-bearers were all victims of Nurgle's rot. Mortals who had contracted the disease and survived the transformation rather than dying cleanly. They remembered their mortal lives, remembered the pain of the infection, remembered the moment when they stopped resisting and accepted what was happening. And that memory informed everything they did in their demonic existence. The endless tallying of plagues, a ritualized repetition of the counting they had done during their illness, marking off symptoms and tracking progression, trying to impose order on the chaos of their transformation. Every plague he crafted was a love letter written in the language of cellular breakdown, an expression of his genuine belief that suffering could be beautiful if one simply stopped resisting and allowed it to run its course. The artistry involved in designing a plague was something Nurgle took seriously. Each disease was unique. tailored to specific circumstances and populations with consideration given to incubation period, transmission vector, symptom severity, and ultimate lethality. A fast-acting plague might be appropriate for a military target where rapid casualty rates would cause maximum disruption. A slow degenerative disease would be better for a civilian population, where long-term suffering would erode morale and create opportunities for cult recruitment. When a plague-bearer tallied the infected, it did so with the diligence of an accountant because every number represented a soul saved from the horror of futile resistance. The numbers were sacred. They were proof of the garden's expansion, evidence of Nurgle's love spreading across the galaxy. Documentation of the great work of transformation that would eventually encompass all living things. The plague bursars kept meticulous records, inscribing tallies onto their own flesh when parchment was unavailable, using blood or pus as ink, ensuring that no infection went uncounted. And Nurgle valued this work, praising his plague-bearers for their dedication, occasionally visiting them in their counting houses to review their tallies and offer encouragement. When a great unclean one laughed, it was not mockery, but joy, the genuine delight of a being who has transcended pain through acceptance. They had suffered terribly in their mortal lives, endured diseases and injuries that would have broken lesser beings, and through that suffering they had found enlightenment. They understood that pain was temporary, but the garden was eternal. That individual existence was fleeting, but the cycle of decay and rebirth continued forever. And in that understanding they found peace, a contentment so complete that it expressed itself as laughter bubbling up from deep inside their bloated forms, like gas escaping from rotting matter. And when Nurgle himself wept, which he did often, his tears were not of sadness, but of overwhelming affection for all the broken suffering, things in the universe that he longed to gather into his garden and protect from the cruelty of hope. This is the paradox at the heart of the Plague Father. He is the kindest of the chaos gods and the cruelest. He offers relief, but ensures that relief can only come through surrender of autonomy and selfhood. He promises eternal life, but delivers it as eternal decay. A state of being where death is impossible, but so is healing. His followers love him because he loves them back genuinely and without condition. But that love is the love of a gardener for his plants, nurturing them not for their sake, but for the beauty of the ecosystem they create together. And perhaps that is why Nurgle endures where other gods might falter. Corn requires rage, and rage can burn out. Sench requires ambition, and ambition can be satisfied or broken. Slaanesh requires sensation, and sensation can be exhausted. But despair is infinite. Decay is universal. Every living thing, no matter how strong or clever or beautiful, will eventually break down. The second law of thermodynamics guarantees it. Entropy always increases. Order always collapses into chaos. And when it does, Nurgle will be there, waiting with open arms and a warm smile, ready to welcome it home to the garden where all things eventually belong. The history of Nurgle is the history of inevitability. It is written in the fossil record of dead worlds and the genetic code of viruses that have outlived entire civilizations. It is carved into the bones of plague victims, buried in mass graves, and whispered in the final breaths of those who died alone and afraid. It is the story of how suffering, when prolonged beyond endurance, curdles into something that resembles peace. And it continues, right now, as you hear these words. New plagues are being born in laboratories and jungles and the bellies of starving children. New cults are forming in the shadows of hive cities, teaching that acceptance is holier than resistance. New warriors are swearing themselves to the death god, sealing their fates in exchange for the promise that they will never truly die. And in the garden, Nurgle tends to his ecosystem with the patience of something that he's already won because time is on his side and time is all there is. The relationship between Nurgle and his brother gods is complex and often misunderstood by mortals who lack the perspective to see the warp's true dynamics. K despises Nurgle for his passivity, seeing the Plague Father's patience as cowardice and his acceptance as weakness. They are natural enemies in the way fire and water are enemies, each negating the other's strengths. A warrior consumed by Khorne's rage cannot succumb to despair because rage is an active state. A rejection of helplessness, a refusal to accept defeat even when defeat is certain. The berserker, who charges into hopeless battle with a war cry on his lips and murder in his heart, cannot simultaneously embrace the resignation that Nurgle offers. Conversely, a soul sunk deep in Nurgle's embrace cannot muster the fury required to serve the blood god. The acceptance of suffering as inevitable directly contradicts the rage against circumstance that Khorne demands. Their demons clash often in the warp. Bloodletters tearing through plague bursers with mindless violence. Brass axes splitting, diseased. Flesh in showers of ichor and pus. But the servants of decay simply regenerate and continue their slow advance, outlasting the rage through sheer attrition, waiting for the bloodletter's fury to exhaust itself so they can resume their patient march. Battles between forces of K and Nurgle rarely end in decisive victory for either side. They simply continue until some external factor intervenes or both sides withdraw to regroup. Tench finds Nurgle tedious, viewing the Plague Father's philosophy as antithetical to change and scheming. Where Tench thrives on transformation and ambition, constantly reshaping himself and his plans in pursuit of goals that may not even exist, Nurgle embodies stagnation and acceptance. The philosophy that change is ultimately futile because all things eventually decay to the same base state. Yet there is a strange respect between them born from the recognition that both deal in inevitability. Sheen's plans always unfold eventually. Reality bending to accommodate his schemes even when they seem to fail in the short term. Nurgle's decay always arrives, patient and certain as the turning of seasons. They are two faces of time, one accelerating toward futures unknown, and the other dragging everything back to primordial simplicity. They occasionally ally when their interests align, Sench providing the strategic framework for campaigns that Nurgle's forces execute with patient persistence. But they never truly trust each other. Sheen suspects that Nurgle's acceptance is a trap, a philosophy designed to prevent change and lock the galaxy in a state of eternal suffering. And Nurgle pies Tenya, seeing in the architect of fate's endless scheming. A refusal to accept the fundamental truth that all plans eventually collapse. All structures eventually crumble. All change eventually resolves into entropic heat death. Slains and Nurgle have the most cordial relationship. Odd as it seems to those who think of the Chaos Gods in simplistic terms of opposition. Both understand obsession. Slaanishes obsesses over sensation, pursuing pleasure and pain to extremes that transcend mortal comprehension. Nurgle obsesses over the beauty of decay, finding aesthetic value in processes that most beings find repulsive. And there is a dark sensuality to rot, a richness of texture and smell and sight that can overwhelm the senses as completely as any senescy excess. The feel of skin gone soft with necrosis, yielding under pressure like overripe fruit. The smell of a corpse 3 days into putrefaction, sweet and cloying and utterly unique. The sight of maggots writing in exposed flesh, their movements hypnotic in their mindless purpose. Devotees of both gods sometimes find common ground in the ecstasy of self-destruction. The pleasure of pushing the body past its limits until it breaks down entirely. There are cults that worship both, seeking transcendence through sensation and decay in equal measure. Their rituals combining the orgastic excess of Slaanishesh with the patient rot of Nurgle in ways that satisfy both gods. And the gods themselves occasionally cooperate, recognizing that their philosophies are not opposed but complementary. Both offer escape from the constraints of conventional existence. Both promise transformation. Both deliver forms of immortality, the one through eternal sensation and the other through eternal decay. The great unclean ones deserve special attention as Nurgle's most favored creations and the demons that most perfectly embody his philosophy. Each one is a mirror of the Plague Father himself, bloated and jovial and utterly devoted to spreading diseases with the enthusiasm of a merchant hawking wares at a market. But they are not mindless. Far from it. Great unclean ones are philosophers and poets capable of complex thought and genuine emotion. They debate the nature of entropy and the aesthetics of decay. They compose hymns to Nurgle that span thousands of verses, each line describing a different plague or aspect of the garden. They keep journals recording their thoughts and observations in books bound with cured human leather and written in inks made from bile and blood. Some have been known to spend centuries on single philosophical treatises, exploring questions like whether suffering has intrinsic value or derives its meaning from the transformation it enables, whether decay is an end state or merely one phase in an eternal cycle, whether Nurgle himself is a conscious being or simply the personification of natural law given voice through the warp. They weep when they see suffering, not because they wish to alleviate it, but because they find it beautiful, tragic, worthy of commemoration. A great unclean, one observing a plague spreading through a hive city, will often pause to appreciate particular deaths, lingering over the bedside of a dying child to note the progression of symptoms, the particular way the disease manifests in young flesh, the emotional impact on the family, and it will weep, genuine tears rolling down its bloated face, mourning the end of the child's suffering when death finally comes because the beauty of the transformation is over. This is not cruelty in any conventional sense. It is aesthetic appreciation taken to an extreme that transcends mortal morality. The great unclean one genuinely mourns, but it mourns the end of beauty, not the death of the child. And when the funeral is held and the family weeps over the tiny corpse, the daemon will weep with them, sharing in their grief while simultaneously feeling joy that another soul has returned to the cycle of decay. They keep gardens within the garden, personal plots where they cultivate unique strains of plague with the care of master vintners breeding grapes. Each great unclean one has its own specialties and preferences, focusing on particular types of disease or methods of transmission. Rotigus, the Rainfather, for example, specializes in waterborne plagues and the corruption of natural water cycles. His garden is a fated swamp filled with stagnant pools where parasites breed in concentrations that turn the water to living sludge. He collects rain from the garden's toxic skies in vast systems, allowing it to ferment and develop new strains of bacteria before releasing it into real space, through summoned rainstorms that carry disease to entire continents. Epidemius, the Talisman of Nurgle, maintains the most extensive garden of all, a vast repository where samples of every plague that has ever existed are preserved and catalogued. His garden is organized with obsessive precision, each disease given its own section and subsection, labeled and indexed according to complex schema that only he fully understands. He walks the paths of his garden daily, checking on his charges, pruning and fertilizing, ensuring that even the oldest and rarest plagues remain viable should they ever be needed again. Some great unclean ones specialize in fast-acting diseases that kill in hours, overwhelming immune systems in hours to maximize the panic and despair that feeds the warp. These plagues are designed for shock value, for causing rapid casualties that disrupt military operations and create cascading failures in emergency response systems. Others prefer slow burns, degenerative conditions that take decades to run their course, ensuring long-term suffering and ample opportunity for the victim to accept Nurgle's comfort. These plagues are more insidious, often difficult to diagnose in their early stages, allowing them to spread widely before anyone realizes what is happening. And some specialize in plagues that are not diseases at all in the conventional sense, but spiritual. Infections, memes that spread through populations and corrupt them from within, turning loyalty into doubt and hope into despair. These psychic plagues are perhaps the most dangerous because they leave no physical trace. The victim seems healthy, but begins to think thoughts that align with Nurgle's philosophy, to see the world through the lens of inevitable decay, to lose the will to resist and accept that surrender is wisdom rather than weakness. They trade samples with each other, discuss the finer points of infection vectors and incubation periods, and compete in friendly contests to see whose latest creation can claim the most souls in a single outbreak. These competitions are taken seriously, but conducted with good humor. The great unclean ones treating them as games rather than conflicts. When one daemon's plague outperforms another's, the loser will congratulate the winner with genuine warmth, asking for details on the design process, seeking to learn from the success. And when they are summoned to real space, they go not with the fury of demons eager for violence, but with the excitement of travelers visiting foreign lands, curious to see what new forms of suffering the material universe has to offer. A great unclean, one manifesting on a battlefield, will often pause mid-combat to examine local flora and fauna, sampling native diseases, collecting specimens to bring back to the garden for study and incorporation into new hybrid plagues. The plague bearers, by contrast, are creatures of routine and melancholy. They were once mortal victims of Nurgle's rot, a disease so virulent and transformative that those who succumb to it do not die, but instead gestate into demonic form, emerging from their own corpses as lesser demons bound eternally to the counting of plagues. The transformation is agonizing and irreversible. The disease attacks every system in the body simultaneously, breaking down tissues and rebuilding them according to demonic templates. Bones dissolve and reform in new configurations. Organs liquefy and reconstitute with different functions. The victim remains conscious throughout, aware of every moment of the transformation, feeling their humanity slipping away as something alien takes its place. And when the transformation is complete, when they crawl from the husk of their mortal body as a plague bearer, may retain memories of what they were, but can never return to it. They are trapped forever in a state of melancholic awareness, knowing what they have lost, but unable to mourn effectively because their emotional range has been truncated, reduced to a narrow band centered on resignation and grim acceptance. They carry rusted swords called plague swords, weapons that weep with supernatural poisons and leave wounds that never heal cleanly. And they wear expressions of permanent misery, their single eyes weeping pus as they tally infections with obsessive precision. The tallying is not optional. It is a compulsion that dominates their existence, an itch that cannot be scratched, a need that can never be fully satisfied. They count infected souls. They count outbreaks. They count symptoms and progressions and fatalities. They inscribe these tallies onto parchment when available, onto walls and floors when not, onto their own flesh as a last resort, using whatever implement is available to make marks that only they can read. And the counting never ends. There are always more plagues to track, more infections to document, more numbers to add to the grand total that Nurgle himself reviews when he walks among his servants. They do not speak unless spoken to, do not laugh like the great unclean ones, do not frolic like the Nurglings. They simply endure. And in that endurance they embody the truth of Nurgle's domain more perfectly than any other. Daemon, they are proof that acceptance does not mean happiness. It means the cessation of resistance, the recognition that suffering is the default state and joy is the aberration. They march to war in silent ranks, killing with mechanical efficiency, spreading plague through every wound they inflict. And when the battle ends, they return to their tallying, noting the number of new infections with the same blank expression they wear always. They are the most tragic of Nurgle's creations because they remember being something else. Remember having hopes and dreams and the capacity for genuine emotion, and they know those things are gone forever. But they cannot even properly grieve the loss because grief requires an emotional depth they no longer possess. Nurglings are the antithesis of plague-bearers in temperament. These tiny demons, no larger than human infants, embody the mischievous, playful aspect of decay. They are born spontaneously from the garden's mulch, emerging from piles of rotting vegetation or pools of stagnant water, fully formed and giggling with the mindless joy of creatures that exist purely in the moment. They swarm in thousands, gnawing on everything they encounter with needle teeth, spreading minor infections through their bites and scratches, giggling incessantly in high-pitched voices that sound like bubbles popping in a cauldron. The sound is disturbing in its cheerfulness, a constant background noise in the garden that newcomers find unsettling until they grow accustomed to it. Nurglings have no concept of personal space or property. They climb on everything, poke their fingers into wounds and orifices, steal food and trinkets, play pranks that range from harmless to genuinely dangerous. But they are beloved by Nurgle despite their chaotic nature because they represent the pure, uncomplicated joy of existence without the burden of self-awareness. They infest the armor of plague marines, nesting in gaps and crevices, peeking out from under pauldrons and greaves to blow raspberries at enemies before retreating into safety. The plague marines tolerate this because the Nurglings are considered gifts from Nurgle, and also because they serve a practical function. Their constant gnawing helps spread infection. Their bodies absorb damage that might otherwise harm the marine, and their presence is psychologically unsettling to enemies who find the juxtaposition of playful giggles and horrific violence deeply disturbing. They are not dangerous individually, their bites carrying only minor infections. Their strength barely sufficient to break unarmored skin. But in sufficient numbers, they can overwhelm even armored warriors through sheer persistence, biting at joints and vision slits until the target is blinded and crippled. And they are unkillable in any meaningful sense. Crush one and three more grow from the stain it leaves. Burn them, and they reform from the ashes. They are fragments of the garden itself, given independent mobility and destroying them is as futile as trying to destroy dirt or water. Plague drones, the rot flies ridden by plague bursers, are among the most horrifying creatures in Nurgle's menagerie. Each fly is the size of a small transport vehicle bloated with disease, its body covered in weeping surs and clusters of eggs that hatch into maggots even as it flies. The eggs develop rapidly, going from larva to pupa to adult in minutes. The new flies bursting from their birth sacs and immediately beginning their own reproductive cycle. This creates a constantly expanding cloud of flies around each rotly, a living shroud that obscures vision and clogs air intakes and spreads infection with every touch. They buzz with a sound like a swarm of hornets amplified through a cathedral's organ pipes, a droning that causes nausea and disorientation in all who hear it. The sound vibrates in the chest cavity, disrupts equilibrium, triggers instinctive revulsion that can break even disciplined formations. The plague bursers who ride them do so with grim professionalism, guiding their mounts through the air with reins made from intestines, dropping plague bombs on enemy positions and sowing terror through their mere presence. The flies themselves are barely sentient, operating on instinct and hunger. But their instinct aligns perfectly with Nurgle's will. They seek out concentrations of life and descend upon them like living plague clouds, spreading infection through their breath and the toxic slime that drips from their bodies. Their saliva contains anticoagulants and paralytic agents, ensuring that wounds from their bites bleed profusely and victims remain conscious during consumption. And when they die, they explode in showers of maggots, an ichor that continue the work of infection long after the parent creature has been destroyed. The maggots burrow into corpses and soil, growing rapidly on whatever nutrients they find, pupating into new flies within hours. This reproductive cycle makes plague drones almost impossible to eradicate. You can kill the adults, but the larvae remain hidden in cracks and shadows, waiting for the opportunity to mature and resume the swarm. The beasts of Nurgle are perhaps the saddest of the Plague Father's creations. And understanding them requires understanding that tragedy and horror are not mutually exclusive. They are enormous, slug-like demons, their bodies covered in sweating wounds and patches of diseased flesh, their mouths filled with rows of blunt teeth designed not for killing but for tasting. Their anatomy defies conventional biology. They have no skeleton but move with surprising speed through muscular contractions that ripple along their length. They secrete slime that is simultaneously lubricant and toxin, allowing them to slide across any surface while leaving trails of contamination. And they possess the intelligence of very young children and the emotional needs to match. They crave affection and playmates, bounding toward any living thing they encounter with the enthusiasm of a puppy greeting its owner, making sounds that might be attempts at friendly communication if they did not emerge from mouths filled with diseased flesh. But everything they touch withers and dies, poisoned by the toxins that seep from their skin. The slime they secrete is laced with virulent plagues, contact with it sufficient to cause severe burns and introduce infections that can kill in hours. They do not understand this. When the creatures they try to befriend collapse and stop moving, the beasts become confused and sad, prodding the corpses with their snouts and whining in distress. They nuzzle against the dead bodies, trying to encourage them to play, unable to comprehend that their affection is lethal. And when their grief reaches a critical mass, when they have watched enough playmates die and accumulated enough sorrow, they undergo a transformation. Their sadness curdles into rage. Their bodies harden and reshape, slug-like forms compacting and developing wings, emerging as rot flies, the very mounts used by plague bearers. It is a cycle of tragedy, innocence corrupted by its own nature, joy transformed into horror through no fault of the beast itself. And Nurgle watches it unfold with the same gentle affection he shows all his children, seeing beauty in their suffering because he cannot conceive of suffering as something to be avoided. To him, the beast's transformation is natural and right, the completion of a cycle that began with playfulness and ends with purpose. The mortal armies that serve Nurgle fight in ways that defy conventional military logic because they operate under different assumptions about what victory means. The Death Guard advance slowly, inexorably, shrugging off wounds that would kill lesser warriors and returning fire with bolters that spit shells filled with compressed plague. Each shell is a work of craft packed with carefully selected diseases designed to maximize suffering in whatever target they hit. Against unarmored targets, the shells burst on impact and release clouds of infectious material that can affect dozens. Against armored targets, they penetrate and inject their payloads directly into the victim, ensuring infection even through sealed environmental systems. The Plague Marines do not aim for quick kills. They aim for lingering death, for wounds that fester and spread, for casualties that tie up enemy medical resources and drain morale through the sight and sound and smell of suffering. They do not retreat. Retreat implies fear of death, and the Death Guard have transcended death. They are already rotting, already plague-ridden, already existing in a state that most beings would consider worse than death. What more can the enemy do to them? Blow off limbs. The limbs will regenerate given time, flesh growing back in twisted parodies of original form. Destroy their armor. They will fight on. Exposed organs dangling, intestines trailing behind them like grotesque banners. Set them on fire. They will burn but continue advancing, their fat rendering and fueling the flames, their bodies becoming walking PS that spread fire and disease together. They do not break. They simply continue forward, step by methodical step, until either they have secured their objective or every one of them has been destroyed, and even destruction is temporary. Nurgle's favor ensures that those who die in his service often return, dragged back from the warp by the sheer gravitational pull of the garden, reborn in bodies that are more diseased and less human than before, but no less capable of war. The cultists who fight alongside them are more fragile but no less devoted, throwing themselves into combat with the fatalistic certainty of people who have already accepted death and therefore have nothing left to lose. They wield improvised weapons, rusted blades scavenged from industrial sites, corroded firearms held together with wire and prayer, clubs studded with nails infected with tetanus and worse. Their equipment is deliberately neglected, left to rust and decay because they see maintenance as resistance to Nurgle's will. A rusty blade carries more blessing than a clean one. A gun that jams frequently teaches patience. Armor that has rotted through in places allows the blessed air of the garden to touch their skin. They die in droves because they are only human, unaugmented, and poorly equipped, facing enemies with superior firepower and training. But their deaths are not meaningless. Every corpse becomes a vector for plague. Every pool of blood attracts flies. Every fallen cultist is a seed from which more infection will grow, their bodies left to rot on the battlefield and release spores that will contaminate the area for years. The strategic philosophy of Nurgle's forces is fundamentally different from other Chaos factions, where K's armies seek to maximize carnage, counting victory in skulls taken and blood spilled. Nurgle's followers focus on endurance and contamination. They establish beachheads and dig in, creating plague fortresses that are nearly impossible to dislodge. These fortresses are not built from conventional materials like stone and steel. They are grown from the dead, corpses piled high and fused together, through supernatural decay until they form walls and towers that pulse with unnatural life. The construction process is both ritual and engineering. Bodies are arranged in specific patterns that have psychic significance, creating geometries that weaken the barrier between warp and real space. They are anointed with sacred fluids, bile and pus, harvested from favored demons, blessed by cultist priests, chanting litanies that praise decay, and they are left to ferment. The biological processes of decomposition accelerated through warp energy until the individual corpses merge into a unified structure, a macroorganism that serves simultaneously as fortification and weapon. The defenders man these walls not as soldiers, but as gardeners, tending to the diseases that bloom in the corpse flesh, cultivating new strains and releasing them into the surrounding environment in carefully timed waves. This is precision work requiring genuine expertise. Different plagues thrive in different conditions, and deploying them at the wrong time or in the wrong combinations can waste their potential. A competent plague gardener knows when to release airborne contagions to catch enemies, during shift changes when containment suits are removed, knows when to contaminate water supplies just before a besieging force is scheduled to resupply, knows which plagues to use against different troop types, selecting nerve agents for lightly armored infantry, corrosive bacteria for armored vehicles, psychic infections for psychers. The fortress becomes a living laboratory, each siege an opportunity to test new theories and refine techniques. Data carefully recorded for transmission back to the garden where the great unclean ones incorporate successful strategies into their grand schemas of pestilence. Attacking such a fortress is an exercise in futility. Artillery barges simply create more corpses to add to the walls, the attacking force literally feeding their enemy with every casualty they inflict. The corpse walls absorb bombardment, the dead flesh cushioning impacts and regenerating damage almost as quickly as it is inflicted. Infantry assaults bog down in fields of toxic sludge that surround the fortress, mows of liquefied flesh and stagnant water that dissolve armor and flesh alike. Soldiers who step into the sludge find themselves sinking, the viscous fluid pulling them down while simultaneously eating through their equipment. Those who make it through arrive at the walls exhausted and infected, weakened by exposure to the ambient corruption. Easy targets for the defenders, who rain down plague grenades and blessed filth from above. And every hour the siege continues. The besiegers grow weaker, sickened by proximity to so much concentrated decay, while the defenders remain constant, immune to the very plagues they spread, sustained by Nurgle's blessing even as their bodies continue to rot. Exterminatus is often the only solution, burning the world from orbit and consigning it to lifelessness. Cyclonic torpedoes crack the crust and expose the mantle. Viral weapons sterilize entire continents. Atmospheric incinerators turn the air itself into flame. The fortresses are destroyed along with everything else, reduced to ash and radioactive glass. But even that is not always enough. Some worlds have been subjected to exterminatus multiple times. Reduced to radioactive cinders, only to have life return in twisted forms. Fungi sprout from ash, their spores viable even after exposure to radiation levels that should sterilize any organic matter. Insects breed in the ruins, feeding on the fungi, evolving rapidly to adapt to the hostile environment. And within decades, a new ecosystem emerges. One shaped entirely by Nurgle's influence and ready to welcome back his servants when they return to reclaim what was theirs. These death worlds become permanent scars on the Imperium. Quarantine zones that must be monitored constantly to prevent reinfection of neighboring systems. Drains on naval resources that tie up ships that might be needed elsewhere. The greatest plague fortresses in the galaxy have become permanent features, quasi-real space manifestations of the garden itself. The Scourge stars, a cluster of systems in the Imperium Nihilus, are entirely given over to Nurgle's dominion. The warp storms that resulted from the Great Rift have made the region nearly impossible to navigate. And those ships that do manage to reach the Scourge stars find conditions that defy description. Entire planets have been transformed into testing grounds for new diseases. Their populations reduced to shambling plague zombies that exist only to incubate the next generation of contagions. The zombies are not mindless in the traditional sense. They retain enough intelligence to perform basic tasks, tending to the plague gardens, harvesting infections from their own bodies, preparing samples for shipment to other worlds. But their higher cognitive functions are gone. Replaced by simple obedience to Nurgle's will, they exist in a state between life and death, animated by diseases that should kill them, but instead sustain them in perpetual decay. The skies of the Scourge stars weep acid rain, the clouds, heavy with pollutants and bacterial blooms that react with atmospheric moisture to create corrosive precipitation. The rain falls continuously. A constant drizzle that etches stone and corrodes metal, that burns exposed flesh and leaves pockmarks on sealed armor. It collects in depressions and forms lakes of acid where nothing can survive except the most virulent bacterial strains, creating pools of living sludge that glow in the dark with bioluminescence generated by metabolic processes. The oceans boil with bacterial blooms that have achieved critical mass. The microorganisms so numerous and so metabolically active that their collective heat raises the water temperature to near boiling. The blooms cast sickly green light across shores littered with the calcified remains of sea creatures, too twisted to survive in any normal environment. Things that evolved and died in the span of days as the oceans transformed from saline to soup. And at the heart of the scourged stars sits the Plague Planet, a world so thoroughly corrupted that it has become an echo of the Garden, a place where the barrier between warp and real space has grown, so thin that demons can cross over without the need for summoning rituals. The planet's surface is a nightmare landscape of fungal forests and toxic swamps, rivers of bile flowing through valleys carved from bone, mountains that are not mountains, but the calcified remains of macroorganisms that grew to continent size before their own mass caused them to collapse. The atmosphere is thick with spores and flies, visibility reduced to meters. Every breath a gamble with infection, and the temperature fluctuates wildly, freezing in some regions and sweltering in others. The climate dictated not by orbital mechanics, but by the whims of the warp energies that saturate the world. Mortarion rules there from a fortress called the Revenant Keep, brooding over his service to Nurgle and planning campaigns with the grim efficiency of a man who has long since stopped hoping for redemption. The keep is built from black iron and diseased bone, a sprawling complex that extends both above and below ground, its architecture shifting subtly when viewed from different angles, as if the building exists partially in dimensions that human perception cannot fully access. The interior is labyrinthine, corridors twisting back on themselves, rooms that seem larger than the space they should occupy, stairs that climb in directions that should not be possible. Navigating it requires either a guide or acceptance that one might never find one's way out. The walls are decorated with trophies from Mortarion's campaigns, banners taken from defeated enemies, skulls of notable kills, vials containing samples of plagues that achieved particular success. And at the center of the keep, in a throne room that reeks of decay and old death, Mortarion sits in contemplation, surrounded by his death guard and attended by demons who serve him with the same devotion they show Nurgle. He is not happy. Daemon Primarchs are capable of emotion, and Mortarion feels his chains acutely, resents his transformation and his bondage, mourns what he has become. But he continues to serve because he sees no alternative, because Nurgle's gifts are both blessing and curse and cannot be refused once accepted. He leads campaigns across the galaxy with tactical brilliance, deploying the Death Guard with precision, coordinating with demonic forces to maximize impact. And he succeeds. Worlds fall to his plague fleets. Sectors collapse under the weight of his diseases. The Imperium reels from each new offensive, unable to predict where he will strike next or how to counter his strategies. But each victory is hollow because it binds him more tightly to Nurgle, proves his value, and ensures his continued service. He is trapped in a cycle of success that enslaves him more completely with each iteration. But Nurgle's true victory is not measured in territory conquered or enemies slain. It is measured in the slow erosion of hope across the galaxy. Every world that falls to plague, every population that accepts Nurgle's gifts, every soldier who lays down their weapon and stops fighting is a validation of the Plague Father's philosophy. He does not need to win wars. He only needs to demonstrate that winning is impossible, that the struggle is futile, that peace can only be found in surrender. And the evidence is overwhelming. The Imperium is crumbling, its infrastructure is failing, its people are exhausted. The Emperor sits on his golden throne, neither living nor dead, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers a day in a ritual that grows less effective with each passing year. The psychic beacon that is the Astronomicon flickers and dims, making warp travel increasingly dangerous, isolating worlds and sectors. The estate's chapters are stretched beyond breaking, fighting on 1,000 fronts against enemies that cannot be defeated, only delayed. The common citizens toil in hive cities where life expectancy is measured in decades if they are lucky, where disease is endemic and medicine is a luxury reserved for the elite, where every day is a repetition of the last and hope for improvement is a childish fantasy. This is the galaxy Nurgle has helped create. not through conquest, but through patient erosion. Not through dramatic gestures, but through 10,000 million small degradations. Each one individually insignificant, but together forming an unstoppable tide of decay, and every soul that breaks under the weight of it. Every person who decides that existence is too painful to continue without the numbing relief of his gifts is a soul claimed for the garden. The numbers are staggering. Billions die every day across the Imperium from preventable diseases. Trillions live in conditions that make disease inevitable. The healthcare infrastructure is so overwhelmed that triage has become the default mode of operation, saving those who can be easily helped and leaving the rest to die. And in the midst of this horror, Nurgle's cultists operate with impunity, spreading their message of acceptance, recruiting the desperate and the dying, building networks that span continents and span worlds. The final lesson of Nurgle is this: decay is not the opposite of life, but its completion. Every flower that blooms carries within it the blueprint of its own wilting. Every civilization that rises does so on foundations that will eventually crumble. The Imperium, for all its might and all its brutality, is a rotting edifice held together by dogma and desperation. And every day it persists is a miracle that defies the natural order. Nurgle does not need to destroy it. He only needs to wait. And when it finally falls, when the last tech priest realizes that the machines can no longer be repaired, and the last priest realizes that the Emperor is not coming to save them, when the people of 10,000 worlds lie down in their habs and decide that tomorrow is not worth the effort of waking, Nurgle will be there. He will walk among them like a father checking on sleeping children, tucking them in with blankets woven from mycelium and whispering that they have done well, that they can rest now that the garden has room for all who are weary, and they will believe him because by then it will be true. Understand this, and you understand the plague, Father. He is not evil in the way mortals conceive of evil. He is the universe expressing its most fundamental truth through the medium of rot and rebirth. He is what happens when suffering becomes so commonplace that it stops being exceptional and starts being structural. He is the smile on the face of a man dying of exposure who has stopped shivering and begun to feel warm. The endorphin rush of a body giving up the fight. The relief that comes when you finally accept that you cannot win and stop exhausting yourself in the effort. He is grandfather and gardener, chronicler and cultivator. And he loves every soul in his domain with the totality of a God who sees no difference between beauty and decay because he understands. They are the same thing viewed from different points in the cycle. And his laughter continues echoing across the garden, rolling through the warp like thunder through storm clouds, touching every dying world and every suffering soul. It is not mocking. It is not cruel. It is the warm chuckle of a being who has seen eternity and recognized it as a garden, who has watched galaxies bloom and wither, who knows that in the end all things return to the soil from which they grew. And in that return there is peace. Not the peace of victory or achievement. Not the peace of resolution or completion, but the peace of release. The peace of letting go. The peace of accepting that you are part of something larger and older and more patient than you can comprehend. The peace of the garden where all are welcome and none are turned away. Where suffering transforms into belonging and decay becomes divine. This is Nurgle. This is his history. This is how the universe learned to love its own ending. And in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, that love grows stronger with each passing moment, spreading like spores on the wind, inevitable as entropy, patient as rot, warm as the embrace of a grandfather welcoming his children home.